The Galactic Assembly Hall was massive beyond human comprehension. Charles Bennett stood at the entrance and felt small for the first time in his diplomatic career. The building stretched for 3 kilometers in every direction, and the ceiling showed a holographic map of the entire galaxy. 247 different alien species sat in their designated areas, and each one looked stranger than the last. Charles wore a simple black suit. Next to him stood Lisa Morgan, and she carried a data pad filled with reports that made his stomach turn. The reports detailed the Korvathi Empire and their war of conquest. 18 months had passed since the Korvathi started their expansion, and nobody had done anything to stop them. Lisa leaned close and whispered into his ear. The Korvathi had taken 12 more star systems in the past week alone. The Trell Confederacy was begging for help, but the Assembly kept voting against intervention. Charles felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his face calm. The session gavel rang out across the massive chamber. The sound was like crystal bells, and it echoed off the walls. Everyone fell silent and turned their attention to the front. Chancellor Vexthor floated above the central platform, and his body was made of liquid mercury held together by force fields. His voice came through translation devices and filled the hall. The Chancellor announced that the Assembly would discuss the Korvathi situation. The Trell had requested military intervention, and the members would now vote on the matter. Charles watched carefully as the voting began. Species after species voted against helping the Trell. Their reasons were always the same and always cowardly. The Korvathi were too strong and too advanced. Fighting them would cost too many lives. It was better to let the weak species fall and then negotiate with whoever won. Charles counted the votes and his jaw tightened. 312 species voted against intervention. Only 47 voted to help. The Trell delegate sat in his chair and his feathers drooped down. The alien looked defeated and hopeless. Charles had seen that look before on human faces during Earth's darkest wars. Something inside Charles snapped. He stood up from his seat and his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every eye and sensor in the chamber turned toward him. Lisa grabbed his arm, but he gently pulled free. Chancellor Vexthor's voice boomed across the hall. The human ambassador was not recognized to speak. Charles should sit down immediately. The protocol was clear, and humans were too new to address the Assembly without permission. Charles ignored the Chancellor and walked down the long aisle toward the central platform. His footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. Lisa hurried behind him, and security drones floated down from the ceiling. The drones hovered uncertainly because nobody had ever done this before. Nobody had ever just walked up to speak without being called. Charles reached the speaking platform and climbed the steps. He turned to face the assembled species of the galaxy and took a deep breath. This moment would change everything, and he knew it. His next words would either save billions of lives or end his career in disgrace. He told them this was wrong. For 18 months, the Assembly had watched the Korvathi slaughter entire civilizations. The members had debated and formed committees and written lengthy reports. They had done everything except the one thing that mattered. They had done nothing to actually help. A delegate from the Sethrak Dominion hissed at him. The snake-like alien said humans knew nothing about galactic politics. Humanity was too young and too ignorant to understand how things worked. Charles should be quiet and learn his place. Charles nodded and agreed. Humans were new to the galactic community and had only been members for 5 years. They did not understand 10,000 years of tradition and protocol and bureaucratic procedure. But humans understood something else that apparently everyone else had forgotten. Humans understood that when innocent people were dying, you did not hide behind committees and rules. Chancellor Vexthor's liquid body rippled with anger. The Assembly had made its decision through proper democratic process. The risk of intervention was too great. The Korvathi fleet alone numbered over 40,000 warships. No single species could stand against them. Fighting would only lead to more death and destruction. Charles looked up at the holographic display above their heads. Red markers showed Korvathi-controlled space spreading across the galaxy like a bloodstain. System after system had fallen, and the red area kept growing. The Korvathi showed no signs of stopping their conquest. They would keep going until someone made them stop. Charles spoke quietly, but his words carried through the translation network to every corner of the massive chamber. He said it was fortunate then that Earth was not bound by the Assembly's decision. Humanity had not voted against intervention. Humans had abstained from the vote specifically for this reason. Earth would do what needed to be done regardless of what the Assembly decided. The chamber exploded into chaos. Aliens jumped to their feet or rose on tentacles or floated upward in agitation. Voices in hundreds of languages shouted at once, and the translation network struggled to keep up. Some species demanded Charles be arrested immediately. Others called for humanity to be expelled from the assembly. A few sat quietly and watched with what might have been approval. Chancellor Vexthor tried to restore order, but his voice was lost in the noise. Security drones moved closer to Charles but stopped when Lisa stepped between them and the ambassador. She held up her datapad and projected images into the air above the platform. The images showed Korvathi prison camps and burned cities and mass graves. The images showed what everyone had been ignoring while they debated. Charles raised his voice and spoke over the chaos. He told them Earth had already mobilized its fleet. 1,200 warships were gathering at the edge of Trell space right now. Human military forces were preparing to engage the Korvathi Empire with or without galactic approval. The decision had been made, and nothing the assembly said would change it. The hall fell silent again. This was unprecedented. Species did not act unilaterally. Members did not ignore assembly decisions. The entire system of galactic governance was built on cooperation and consensus. Charles was threatening to tear that system apart. But Charles did not care about their system anymore. He had spent 18 months watching that system fail. He had watched committees meet and debate while billions died. He had read reports about Korvathi atrocities while the assembly formed subcommittees to study the situation. He was done waiting for permission to do the right thing. Chancellor Vexthor demanded to know what gave humanity the right to make this decision alone. Charles responded that somebody had to make it. Somebody had to stand up and fight. Somebody had to care more about lives than about following proper procedure. If the assembly would not be that somebody, then Earth would. The Korvathi ambassador stood up. General Throcknall was 7 feet tall and covered in scales and wore elaborate military armor. He pointed one clawed finger at Charles and laughed. The sound was harsh and mocking. He said humans were fools who would be crushed. The Korvathi Empire would add Earth to the list of conquered species. Human arrogance would lead only to human extinction. Charles looked at the Korvathi general and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. He told the general that humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other before reaching the stars. Humanity had perfected the art of warfare through countless conflicts. Every human military academy studied battles and strategies going back centuries. Humans knew war in ways these peaceful species could never understand. He said the Korvathi expected everyone to fight by galactic rules. They expected honor and formal declarations and battles in open space. Charles promised them that humans would not fight that way. Humanity would use every dirty trick and ambush and tactical advantage they could find. The Korvathi had never faced an enemy like Earth before. Lisa pulled up another display showing the human fleet composition. Carriers and battleships and destroyers and support vessels all moved into position. The fleet was not as large as the Korvathi Armada, but it was designed differently. Human ships were built for the kind of brutal, efficient warfare that Earth had practiced for millennia. Charles turned back to the assembly and made his final statement. Earth was not asking for permission and was not requesting support. Humans were simply informing the galaxy of their intentions. The Korvathi Empire would be stopped. The Trell and other threatened species would be protected. This would happen regardless of what anyone in this chamber thought about it. He climbed down from the platform and walked back up the aisle. Lisa followed him, and the crowd parted to let them through. Some aliens looked angry and others looked shocked. A few looked grateful. The Trell delegate watched Charles pass and pressed his wing hand to his chest in what humans had learned was a gesture of deep respect. As Charles reached the exit, he heard Chancellor Vexthor calling for an emergency vote. The assembly would decide whether to sanction Earth for this violation of protocol. Charles did not stop walking. He did not care what they decided. The time for voting and debating was over. The time for action had begun. Admiral Gregory Kane stood on the bridge of the USS Liberty and watched the final preparations through the massive viewport. The flagship carrier was the pride of Earth's military, and right now it served as the command center for humanity's boldest operation. Around the Liberty, hundreds of warships moved into formation like a school of metal fish preparing to strike. 1,200 vessels represented the combined strength of every nation on Earth, working together for the first time in history. The bridge crew worked quietly at their stations. Commander Paul Griffin monitored communications and his screen showed constant updates from other ships. Lieutenant Commander Helen Walsh managed tactical displays and her fingers moved across holographic controls. Captain Nathan Cole stood near Gregory and reviewed status reports. Everyone knew what was coming and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Paul looked up from his station and reported another transmission from the Galactic Assembly. They were demanding that the human fleet stand down immediately. The message threatened sanctions and possible military action if Earth did not comply. Gregory told Paul to file it with the others. This was the 47th such demand in 6 hours. The assembly was panicking, but their panic changed nothing. Helen brought up the strategic display in the center of the bridge. A holographic map showed Corvathi fleet movements across multiple star systems. She highlighted a cluster of red icons moving toward Trell space. Intelligence confirmed the enemy was mobilizing for a final assault on the Trell homeworld. The Corvathi fleet consisted of approximately 8,000 capital ships, plus countless support vessels and fighters. The bridge fell completely silent. Even the most optimistic officers had to acknowledge the mathematics of the situation. The enemy outnumbered human forces by nearly 8-1. Every tactical simulation showed poor odds of success. Some simulations predicted total human defeat within the first 12 hours of engagement. Gregory studied the numbers without emotion. He had commanded fleets for 20 years and understood that battles were won by more than simple arithmetic. He asked his officers for their thoughts. Nathan stepped forward and suggested they could wait for reinforcements. The European Federation and Asian Alliance both had fleets preparing to join them. With combined forces, the odds would improve significantly. Helen shook her head and pointed to the timeline projections. The Trell did not have time to wait for reinforcements. Current intelligence indicated the Corvathi would begin planetary bombardment in 72 hours. Waiting meant condemning 6 billion Trell civilians to death. The moral calculus was simple, even if the military calculus was not. Gregory moved closer to the holographic display and examined the Corvathi fleet formation. The enemy ships moved in loose clusters spread across a wide front. Their confidence showed in every aspect of their deployment. The Corvathi expected no real resistance. They had conquered 47 star systems without facing serious opposition. They believed the pattern would continue forever. He told his officers that the Corvathi expected everyone to fight according to galactic conventions. Those conventions required formal declarations and honorable engagements in battles fought in open space. The rules demanded fairness and predictability. Gregory smiled coldly and said humans were not going to follow those rules. Earth had different traditions when it came to warfare. He manipulated the hologram and highlighted a nebula cluster along the Corvathi route of advance. The Veil Nebula was a massive cloud of gas and dust that stretched across several light-years. Most species avoided fighting in such environments because sensors did not work properly, and communications became difficult. It was considered dishonorable to use environmental hazards as tactical advantages. Gregory explained his plan. The human fleet would hide inside the nebula and wait for the Corvathi to pass through. When the enemy entered the cloud, the humans would strike from ambush at point-blank range. They would hit hard and fast and brutal. They would target command ships and supply vessels and communication relays. They would turn the nebula into a killing ground. Paul looked uncomfortable. He reminded the Admiral that ambush tactics violated the Treaty of Kelvin. Using environmental hazards as weapons was considered a war crime by galactic standards. If humans fought this way, they would lose any moral authority. Other species would view Earth as barbaric and uncivilized. Gregory turned to face his communications officer. He asked Paul what was more barbaric, using an ambush to save billions of lives or following rules while watching genocide happen. Paul had no answer. Gregory said the Corvathi had already shown they did not care about rules or treaties or civilized behavior. Fighting them with honor would only guarantee defeat. Nathan spoke up and asked about the tactical details. The nebula would interfere with human sensors just as much as Corvathi systems. How would they coordinate attacks if communications were disrupted? Gregory smiled and explained that human ships had been training for exactly this scenario. Earth's military had centuries of experience fighting in difficult conditions. Radio silence and pre-planned attack patterns would work just fine. Helen pulled up weapons readiness reports. All forward batteries were loaded and ready. Torpedo tubes were armed with armor-piercing warheads. Fighter squadrons were prepped for launch. The human fleet was as ready as it would ever be. Gregory gave the order to move into position inside the nebula. The Liberty led the way and the rest of the fleet followed in tight formation. 3 days passed while the human ships waited in darkness. The nebula surrounded them like a thick fog, and sensors could barely see a few thousand kilometers. Crews stayed at battle stations and tension mounted with each passing hour. Some officers wondered if the Korvathi would change course. Others worried that the plan would fail and humanity would be destroyed in the opening engagement. Then the sensors picked up massive energy signatures approaching the nebula. The Korvathi Third Fleet was entering the cloud right on schedule. Gregory ordered complete radio silence. Every ship in the human fleet went dark and waited like predators in tall grass. The enemy came closer and closer until their massive warships were visible even through the nebula's interference. Gregory gave the attack order. Torpedoes launched from 1,000 hidden positions simultaneously. The weapons crossed the short distance in seconds and slammed into Korvathi shields. Explosions rippled across enemy hulls as the shields collapsed under concentrated fire. Before the Korvathi could react, human destroyers burst from concealment at ranges measured in kilometers rather than the usual thousands of kilometers. Railguns opened fire and solid metal projectiles punched through armor plating like paper. The Korvathi fleet tried to form defensive formations, but the humans refused to cooperate. Human ships scattered in every direction and then reformed to attack from new angles. Fighter squadrons led by pilots like Commander Jake Harrison and Lieutenant Maya Foster wove through the confusion. They targeted command ships and communication arrays. Without coordination, the Korvathi fleet became a mob of individual ships fighting separate battles. Gregory watched the tactical display and called out new orders. He told his fleet to target logistics vessels. Fuel ships and ammunition barges and repair craft were all legitimate targets. Make the enemy fight blind and desperate. Cut off their supplies and watch them panic. This was how humans fought when survival was at stake. The battle raged for 16 hours without pause. Human ships darted in and out of the nebula clouds. They would appear and attack and disappear before the Korvathi could respond effectively. The enemy tried to pursue, but human vessels were faster and more maneuverable. Every time the Korvathi thought they had cornered a human squadron, those ships would lead them into another ambush. Helen monitored casualty reports and her face remained professionally neutral even as the numbers climbed. Earth lost ships in the engagement. Brave crews died when Korvathi weapons found their marks. The destroyer Falcon took a direct hit and exploded with all hands. The cruiser Denver lost power and drifted helplessly until a rescue ship could retrieve survivors. 84 human vessels would not be returning home. But the Korvathi losses were catastrophic. 2,300 enemy ships limped away from the nebula when the battle finally ended. Their formations were shattered and their confidence was broken. The mighty Third Fleet that had destroyed dozens of civilizations now fled in disorder. Human forces had won the first major victory against the Korvathi Empire. Gregory stood on the bridge and felt no joy in the triumph. He thought about the crews who had died following his orders. He thought about families on Earth who would receive notifications about lost loved ones. War was ugly even when you won, especially when you won. Paul reported that every major news network in the galaxy was broadcasting footage of the battle. Someone had recorded the engagement and released it publicly. The entire galactic community was watching human forces tear apart a Korvathi fleet. Species that had cowered in fear were now seeing that the Empire could be defeated. Nathan pointed out that the victory would change everything. Other species would see that resistance was possible. The emergency session of the Galactic Assembly was unlike anything in recorded history. Every species had sent their highest representatives and the chamber filled beyond capacity. Additional seating had been installed and viewing platforms floated in the air. The atmosphere crackled with tension as thousands of aliens waited to see what would happen next. Chancellor Vexthor called the meeting to order, but his usual authority seemed diminished by the circumstances. Ambassador Charles Bennett sat in the human delegation section with Lisa Morgan on his left and Admiral Gregory Kane on his right. The Admiral had been summoned directly from the fleet and still wore his military uniform. Charles could feel hundreds of eyes and sensors focused on their small group. The humans were either heroes or criminals depending on which species you asked. Vexthor began by listing the charges against humanity. Earth had violated 17 different treaties in the past month. Humans had ignored direct orders from the Assembly. They had engaged in warfare tactics that many species considered barbaric and uncivilized. The Chancellor demanded that Charles explain these actions immediately. Charles stood slowly and felt the weight of history pressing down on him. His next words would determine Earth's future relationship with the galactic community. He could apologize and beg forgiveness. He could make excuses and promise to follow the rules. Instead, he looked directly at Vexthor and stated a simple fact. Humanity had saved 6 billion Trell lives. They had stopped an empire that was committing systematic genocide. Yes, they had done it without permission. A delegate from the Chennari Collective rose from her seat. The crystalline being shimmered with agitation as she spoke. Humans had attacked from ambush like cowards. They had targeted civilian supply vessels. They had shown no honor in battle. The Chennari demanded that Earth be punished for these violations. Charles turned to face the Chennari delegate. He asked if she remembered 8 months ago when the Korvathi had attacked her species. 40 million Chennari had been enslaved and forced to work in mining operations. The Chennari government had begged the Assembly for help. The Assembly had formed a committee to study the situation. Charles asked what good that committee had done for the 40 million slaves. The Chennari delegate's crystalline structure flickered and dimmed. She had no answer. She slowly sat back down and refused to meet anyone's gaze. Other delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Charles had touched on the central shame that every species felt. They had all watched the Korvathi atrocities and done nothing. A new voice boomed across the chamber. General Thrucknall stood in the Korvathi section, and his scales gleamed under the lights. The reptilian alien pointed one clawed finger at Charles and spoke with contempt. Humans fought like savages who understood nothing of civilized warfare. They did not deserve membership in the galactic community. Earth should be isolated and quarantined before their barbarism spread. Admiral Gregory Kane laughed. The sound was harsh and echoed through the sudden silence. He stood beside Charles and addressed the Korvathi general directly. Gregory asked if civilized warfare was what the Korvathi called it, when they burned planets from orbit. Was it civilized when they took civilians as slaves? Was it civilized when they conducted medical experiments on prisoners? Gregory pulled out a datapad and threw it onto the central platform. The device activated and holographic images appeared above the assembly floor. The images showed Korvathi concentration camps with thousands of aliens in cages, burned cities where nothing lived, mass graves filled with bodies, evidence of systematic torture and genocide. The Admiral explained that human forces had found these sites at every world the Korvathi conquered. Earth had documented everything and gathered testimony from survivors. Gregory said if the Korvathi wanted to discuss civilized behavior, then humanity had quite a lot to share with the Assembly. Perhaps everyone would like to see exactly what kind of empire they had been tolerating. The chamber erupted in chaos. Some species shouted in anger at the Korvathi. Others demanded the images be removed. A few aliens looked away, unable to watch the evidence of atrocities they had ignored. Thrucknall roared and claimed the images were fabricated. Human propaganda designed to turn the galaxy against his people. Lisa Morgan stepped forward and her voice cut through the noise. She stated that everything could be verified. Earth had shared all evidence with independent investigators. Medical examiners from neutral species had confirmed the authenticity. The Korvathi could deny reality all they wanted, but the truth remained unchanged. They were monsters who had been allowed to operate freely for far too long. Vexthor tried to restore order. The Chancellor's liquid form swirled rapidly as he attempted to regain control of the session. He acknowledged that Korvathi crimes were serious, but insisted that did not justify human actions. Humanity could not simply ignore galactic law whenever they disagreed with Assembly decisions. That path led to chaos and anarchy. Charles asked what good galactic law had done for the conquered species. What protection had all those treaties provided? He pointed at the holographic images still floating above the platform. Those people had trusted the Assembly to protect them. They had believed in the system. They had followed all the proper procedures and filed all the correct appeals. Now they were dead. A delegate from the Fexian Commonwealth stood and spoke in a measured tone. The insectoid alien acknowledged human courage but questioned the precedent being set. If every species acted on their own judgment without Assembly approval, then there would be no unity. The galactic community would fragment into competing factions. Cooperation would become impossible. Lisa responded with a question. What was the point of unity if it meant standing united while innocents died? She displayed a projection showing Korvathi territorial expansion over the past 18 months. The red zone had grown exponentially. Mathematical models predicted the Empire would reach the core worlds within 2 years. Every species in the chamber would eventually face the same choice the Trell had faced: submit or die. She changed the display to show casualty projections. If the Korvathi continued unchecked, they would kill an estimated 2 trillion beings within 5 years. 2 trillion lives lost because the Assembly preferred committees to action. Lisa asked if unity was worth that price. She asked if following proper procedure mattered when entire civilizations were being erased. Charles stepped forward again and his voice was calm but firm. He told the Assembly that humanity was not asking for permission anymore. Earth had already decided to fight. Human forces would continue engaging the Korvathi until the Empire was defeated or Earth was destroyed trying. The only question was whether other species would join them or continue hiding behind protocol. He explained that humans needed intelligence sharing and logistical support. Earth was not demanding military assistance, though they would welcome it. All humanity asked was that other species stop actively hindering the war effort. Stop condemning human tactics and start providing useful information. Help humanity save the galaxy or at least get out of the way. Throcknall laughed bitterly. He asked what humanity expected in return for this supposed heroism. Did humans want territory, resources, political power? Every species had motives, and the Korvathi general wanted to know Earth's true agenda. Nobody fought a war without expecting something in return. Gregory answered before Charles could speak. The Admiral said humans wanted other species to survive. That was the entire agenda. Earth had learned brutal lessons in their own history. Humanity had seen what happened when good people did nothing while evil spread. Too many humans had died in wars that could have been prevented if someone had acted sooner. Earth refused to watch that pattern repeat on a galactic scale. Charles added that humanity remembered what it was like to be the victims. Earth had experienced wars of aggression and attempted genocides. Humans understood what the conquered species were feeling right now: terror and helplessness and desperation. If humanity had the power to prevent that suffering, then they had the moral obligation to use that power. The chamber fell silent. Delegates looked at each other uncertainly. Some seemed moved by Charles's words. Others remained skeptical. The Trell delegate stood and pressed his wing hand to his chest. He stated that the Trell people would stand with humanity. Earth had proven their friendship with actions, not words. Whatever help the Trell could provide would be given freely. More species began standing. The Chennari delegate rose and offered her people's advanced shield technology. The Sethrak offered access to their intelligence networks. One by one, species that had voted against intervention began changing sides. They saw which way the wind was blowing and decided it was better to join the winning team. Chancellor Vexthor watched his carefully maintained neutrality crumble. The Assembly was fracturing along new lines. Species that had been allies for centuries were now choosing sides in a human war. Vexthor knew he had lost control, but he had to maintain some semblance of authority. He called for a formal vote on recognizing Earth's military actions as legitimate defense of threatened species. The voting began, and green lights appeared across the chamber. Charles watched the tally climb higher: 100 species in favor, then 150. Admiral Gregory Kane stood in the command center of Fort Haven and studied the tactical display that dominated the entire wall. The forward operating base had been established in neutral territory and now served as headquarters for the largest military coalition in galactic history. Around him, representatives from 19 different species worked alongside human officers. The room buzzed with activity as data streamed in from across multiple star systems. Commander Helen Walsh highlighted several clusters of enemy positions on the main screen. Intelligence gathered by Varuni scouts indicated major Korvathi staging areas in 3 locations. The Empire was consolidating forces for a massive counteroffensive. Their target was obvious. The Korvathi planned to strike directly at the core worlds and destroy the coalition before it could grow stronger. Gregory asked about current force strength. Captain Nathan Cole pulled up fleet composition data. The human armada had grown to 4,000 vessels with reinforcements arriving daily from Earth. Allied species contributed another 2,500 ships. Combined fleet strength stood at approximately 6,500 warships. It was an impressive number, but still not enough. Helen overlaid enemy force projections onto the display. The Korvathi were committing 18,000 ships to their offensive. They had stripped garrison forces from occupied territories and called in every available vessel. The Empire was not holding anything back. This would be a decisive battle that determined the war's outcome. Gregory stared at the numbers and felt the weight of responsibility. Every tactical simulation showed the same result. The coalition could not win a direct engagement against such overwhelming force. The Korvathi had learned from their defeat at the Veil Nebula. They would not be caught by surprise again. Their formations were tight and their commanders were cautious. Lisa Morgan entered the command center carrying reports from the diplomatic corps. She had been coordinating with allied governments and securing commitments for the upcoming battle. Lisa joined Gregory at the display and studied the enemy positions. She asked if he had developed a strategy yet. Gregory admitted he was still working on it. Nathan pointed out the obvious problem. The coalition lacked the numbers for direct confrontation. Even with superior human tactics and allied technology, they would be outnumbered nearly 3-1. Those odds were not survivable no matter how skilled the crews were. They needed a different approach entirely. Gregory turned to Commander Kevin Shaw, who managed intelligence operations. He asked about Korvathi logistics and supply lines. Kevin brought up a new display showing the Empire's complex network of depot stations and supply routes. The Korvathi war machine depended on constant resupply of fuel and ammunition, and spare parts. Their ships consumed massive resources during combat operations. Kevin highlighted 7 major depot stations that served as hubs for the entire supply network. These facilities stored everything the Korvathi fleet needed to sustain their offensive. Each depot was defended by over 1,000 warships plus extensive fixed defenses. Attacking even one would be extremely costly. Lisa studied the depot locations and understood immediately. If the coalition could destroy those supply hubs, the Korvathi offensive would collapse. Enemy fleets would run out of fuel and ammunition deep in hostile territory. They would be forced to retreat or surrender. It was brilliant strategy but practically impossible to execute. Nathan voiced the concern everyone was thinking. The coalition did not have enough ships to attack 7 heavily defended targets simultaneously. They would need to concentrate forces to overwhelm each depot in turn. But that would take too long. The Korvathi would realize what was happening and adjust their strategy. Gregory smiled for the first time in days. He said they would not use conventional forces for the attacks. Humanity had been working with allied species to develop new tactical approaches. The Varuni had shared their advanced cloaking technology. The Chitauri had provided enhanced shield matrices. The Trell had contributed sophisticated guidance systems. Human engineers had integrated everything into specialized strike packages. He called up ship roster data showing new vessel classifications. Stealth squadrons equipped with Varuni cloaking devices. Heavy assault groups carrying Chitauri-enhanced weapons. Precision bombing wings with Trell targeting systems. Each unit had trained relentlessly for specific mission profiles. They were ready to operate independently across vast distances. Lisa asked if he was seriously proposing 7 simultaneous attacks on hardened military installations. Gregory confirmed that was exactly the plan. The strikes would happen at the same moment across a front spanning hundreds of light years. The Korvathi would have no time to respond or reinforce threatened positions. Speed and coordination would replace numerical superiority. Over the following 6 weeks, the coalition forces reorganized into specialized strike groups. Captain Susan Wright took command of the stealth squadron designated Shadow Flight. Her ships practiced infiltration techniques and learned to hide their signatures using Varuni technology. Lieutenant Commander Alex Torres led the heavy assault group called Hammer Force. His vessels mounted devastating weapons that could punch through the strongest shields. Commander Olivia Grant directed the precision bombing wings known as Scalpel Teams. Her pilots trained on simulation after simulation until they could hit targets with perfect accuracy. Every officer and crew member understood their role. This operation had no margin for error. Failure meant the coalition would lose the war. Gregory held final briefings with each strike group commander. He emphasized timing above everything else. All 7 attacks had to occur within a 5-minute window. If the Korvathi got warning at even one location, they might have time to alert the others. Surprise was the only advantage the coalition possessed. The strike forces departed Fort Haven and traveled to their assigned targets. Susan Wright's Shadow Flight approached Sentinel Prime Depot, using routes that avoided Korvathi patrol patterns. Her ships dropped into normal space just outside the defensive perimeter and activated their cloaking systems. The vessels became invisible to standard sensors as they drifted closer to the target. Alex Torres brought Hammer Force out of jump space directly in front of Nexus Station. His heavy cruisers opened fire immediately, and their enhanced weapons tore into defensive platforms. Olivia Grant's bombers emerged from a different vector and circled around behind the station. The Korvathi defenders found themselves caught between two fires. At each depot, the pattern repeated. Stealth ships appeared inside defensive zones where they should not exist. Heavy assault groups smashed through fortifications with overwhelming firepower. Precision bombers struck critical systems with surgical accuracy. The Korvathi defenders fought bravely, but they had never trained for this kind of coordinated attack. Susan Wright's squadron reached the fuel storage area at Sentinel Prime. Her weapons officer launched torpedoes that penetrated deep into the facility before detonating. The resulting explosions ignited stored fuel reserves. Secondary blasts rippled through the entire depot as one tank after another exploded. 800 defending vessels died in the inferno along with the station itself. Alex Torres coordinated his assault with perfect timing. Hammer Force absorbed the enemy's attention, while Olivia Grant's bombers systematically destroyed ammunition magazines and repair facilities. When Nexus Station finally exploded, the shockwave damaged dozens of nearby Korvathi ships. The survivors fled in disorder, abandoning their posts. Gregory watched status updates flow into Fort Haven from across the combat zone. Green indicators appeared as objectives were achieved. Sentinel Prime destroyed, Nexus Station eliminated, Thunder Rock Depot rendered inoperable. One by one, the Korvathi supply hubs fell. The seventh and final attack succeeded 23 minutes after the first. All targets had been neutralized, the Korvathi offensive ground to an immediate halt. Fleet commanders realized their supply lines had been cut. Ships began reporting critical shortages of fuel and ammunition. Some vessels were stranded in deep space, unable to jump to safety. Others tried to retreat but ran out of fuel before reaching friendly territory. The mighty armada that was supposed to crush the coalition instead found itself dying slowly in the void. Helen monitored enemy communications and reported increasing panic. Korvathi admirals were demanding explanations from their logistics command. Supply officers had no answers to give. The depot network that had sustained the Empire's expansion was simply gone. 18,000 warships were now floating metal coffins waiting for their fuel to run out. Nathan pulled up casualty reports for coalition forces. The strike groups had performed brilliantly, but not without cost. Shadowflight lost 19 ships, including 2 of Susan Wright's escorts. Hammer Force suffered moderate damage across most vessels. Scalpel teams lost 11 bombers to defensive fire. Total coalition casualties stood at 147 ships destroyed and several hundred more damaged. Gregory studied the numbers and felt the familiar weight of command. 147 ships meant thousands of dead crew members. Families on dozens of worlds would receive devastating news. The victory had been decisive, but it came at a price measured in lives. War always demanded payment in blood. 6 months had passed since the coalition destroyed the Korvathi supply depots, and now Ambassador Charles Bennett stood once again before the Galactic Assembly. The chamber looked different than he remembered. Species that had once sat in isolated sections now mingled freely. Delegates shared information and coordinated policies. The war had forced cooperation, and that cooperation had become habit. Chancellor Vexthor called the session to order, and his liquid mercury form seemed more settled than before. The Chancellor announced that the Korvathi Empire had requested a formal ceasefire. Their ambassador wished to address the assembly. Charles watched as General Throcknall entered the chamber and barely recognized the alien. The proud warrior who had mocked humanity now wore simple robes instead of elaborate armor. His scales looked dull and his posture showed defeat. Throcknall walked slowly to the central platform. He climbed the steps like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. When he reached the speaking position, he stood silent for a long moment. Then he spoke words that no one expected. The Korvathi Empire acknowledged complete defeat. They requested terms of surrender from the coalition forces. The chamber remained utterly silent. Species that had feared the Korvathi for decades now watched their former tormentor beg for mercy. Charles felt no satisfaction in the moment. He had seen too much death and destruction to take joy in anyone's defeat. War created only victims regardless of which side lost. Charles stood and walked to the platform. Lisa Morgan accompanied him carrying documentation of proposed surrender terms. Admiral Gregory Kane remained in his seat but watched carefully. The military phase of the war had ended, but the diplomatic phase was just beginning. This moment would determine what kind of peace followed the fighting. Charles outlined the coalition's requirements. Complete withdrawal from all conquered territories within 90 days. All slaves and prisoners would be released immediately. Reparations would be paid to affected species over a period of 50 years. The Korvathi military would be reduced to defensive forces only. War criminals would stand trial before a galactic tribunal. Thrucknall listened to each term without protest. When Charles finished, the general simply nodded. The Korvathi accepted all conditions without negotiation. They had no leverage and no options. Their empire was broken and their fleet was captured or destroyed. Continued resistance would only lead to complete annihilation. But Charles added one final requirement. The Korvathi military would be reformed under direct galactic oversight. Their remaining ships would serve the Assembly, not an empire. Korvathi forces would become peacekeepers working to protect the very species they had once threatened. For a warrior culture, this represented the ultimate humiliation. Thrucknall closed his eyes and his whole body seemed to sag. Several long seconds passed before he responded. The general said his people would accept even this condition. The Korvathi had no pride left to protect. They would serve however the galaxy demanded. His voice carried such defeat that several delegates looked away in discomfort. The assembly erupted in celebration. Delegates from dozens of species cheered and made sounds of joy. The war that had threatened the entire galaxy was finally over. The Korvathi threat had been eliminated. Civilizations could begin rebuilding. Charles stood among the celebration and felt only emptiness. Lisa noticed his expression and moved closer. She asked quietly if he was all right. Charles looked at her and mentioned the cost. 43,000 human personnel had died during the war. 43,000 families would never be whole again. Tens of thousands more from allied species had also perished. The victory came soaked in blood. Lisa reminded him gently that they had saved billions of lives. The Trell civilization still existed because humans intervened. Dozens of other species avoided extinction. The sacrifice had meaning even if that meaning did not ease the pain. Charles nodded, but the knowledge did not help much. Vexthor approached them after the celebration died down. The Chancellor extended a pseudopod holding a crystalline metal that pulsed with inner light. He announced that the Assembly wished to present Charles with the Star of Valor. It was the highest honor the galactic community could bestow. Vexthor praised humanity's courage and sacrifice and unwavering commitment to justice. Charles accepted the medal because refusing would be insulting. But he felt no pride in the award. He told Vexthor that humans had not fought for honor or recognition. Earth intervened because it needed to be done. Someone had to stand up against injustice. Silence in the face of evil was itself a form of evil. He looked around the chamber at the assembled species. Charles said they all knew the Korvathi were wrong. Everyone recognized the Empire had to be stopped. But knowing was not enough. Wisdom without action was worthless. The galaxy had possessed all the knowledge necessary but lacked the will to act. That failure had cost millions of lives. Charles held up the medal and stated it belonged to every person who fought. Every human who gave their life. Every alien who stood beside them. Every being who chose action over debate. The award honored their sacrifice, not any individual achievement. Charles hoped the galaxy would remember that lesson when the next crisis came. He returned to his seat and noticed something remarkable. Delegates throughout the chamber were standing. Species after species rose in a silent salute. Even Thrucknall stood with his head bowed in respect. The gesture acknowledged not just human victory, but the price paid for that victory. Charles felt tears threatening, but maintained his composure. Months passed, and Charles found himself on Earth standing in Arlington National Cemetery. Rows of white markers stretched across rolling hills as far as he could see. Each stone bore the name of someone who died serving humanity. A new section had been added for casualties from the Korvathi War. The stones looked too clean and too white against the green grass. Admiral Gregory Kane stood beside. Charles and both men wore formal uniforms. They had come to pay respects to the fallen. Gregory asked if Charles thought the sacrifice was worth it. The question hung in the air like smoke. Charles did not answer immediately because he did not have a simple answer. He finally said to ask him in 100 years. Ask when they could see what kind of galaxy grew from this sacrifice. Ask when enough time had passed to judge whether the peace lasted. Gregory nodded, understanding. Some questions had no immediate answers. They stood in silence as the sun set over the cemetery. Long shadows stretched across the field of white stones. Charles thought about each name on each marker. Everyone represented a person with family and friends and dreams. All those futures had been traded for a galaxy that might now have a chance at lasting peace. In orbit above Earth, the human fleet returned home. The USS Liberty led the formation, and her hull showed scars from multiple battles. Aboard the flagship, young officers who had aged beyond their years told stories of the war. They spoke of friends who would never return. They remembered battles won and the terrible cost of each victory. Commander Olivia Grant stood on the bridge of her destroyer. She had been promoted to captain after her performance during the depot raids. Olivia pulled out a photograph of her original crew. Most of the faces in the picture were gone now. She whispered to their memory that they had accomplished their mission. They had saved countless lives. She hoped that would be enough. Behind her, the new crew worked efficiently at their stations. They were veterans now, despite being so young. The war had taught them hard lessons about sacrifice and duty, and the price of freedom. None of them would ever be the same. War changed everyone it touched. On Earth, a woman named Karen Price sat in her apartment in Chicago. She held a letter from the Trell Confederacy addressed to her son who had died at Corvati Prime. The letter thanked him for his sacrifice. It explained that because he and others like him fought bravely, 6 million Trell children had been evacuated safely. His name would be remembered in Trell history forever. Karen cried while holding the letter against her chest. Her son was gone and nothing could bring him back. But he had mattered. His death had meaning. Somewhere across the galaxy, children were alive because her boy had been brave. She did not know if that made the pain easier, but it made the loss bearable. Across the galaxy, reconstruction began. Species that had been enemies worked together to rebuild shattered worlds. The Corvati labored alongside those they had once enslaved. Former victims and former oppressors cooperated because survival demanded it. Slowly and painfully, a new order emerged from the ashes of the old. In the ruins of the Corvati homeworld, workers from 100 species built monuments. They raised hospitals and schools where military bases once stood. On the largest monument, they inscribed words in thousands of languages. The human translation read simply that this memorial honored those who stood when others sat, who fought when others debated, who gave everything so others could have tomorrow. The Galactic Assembly established new protocols based on lessons learned during the war. When future crises emerged, the Assembly would act quickly rather than form committees. Military intervention would be authorized when genocide threatened. The galaxy would never again watch passively while civilizations burned. These promises were easy to make in peacetime, but Charles hoped they would hold when tested.